The White Queen is the story of a woman with dragon-like eyes, whose forbidden love changed the course of English history. Elizabeth Woodville. But how much of what we saw in the series is based on real history? And how much is just another invention by Philippa Gregory and the show's creators? Let's figure it out together in this video. After its release, the White Queen series received quite a bit of criticism. Most of it focused on costume and set design errors. People pointed out modern zippers and stitching on the dresses, or visible plumbing and construction elements in the background that clearly didn't exist in the 15th century. But honestly, I don't see much point in nitpicking things like that. Let's be real. Would any of us actually want to watch the show if the women looked exactly like they did in the mid-1450s? Back then, fashion could be pretty shocking. One of the trends was to shave off your eyebrows and the front part of your hairline to make your forehead look as big and childlike as possible. Some historians even think it may have been partly for hygiene, to reduce the number of places lice could hide. And don't even get me started on the headwear. The show does attempt to feature some authentic pieces on background characters, but not on Elizabeth herself. Which is a bit ironic because in her most famous portrait, Elizabeth Woodville was actually wearing a hennin, that tall cone-shaped headdress with a giant veil, kept in place by wire. Since we've touched on appearances, here's an interesting fact about Edward IV, Elizabeth's husband. First of all, he had long chestnut hair just like his brothers. For some reason, chestnut hair was considered the peak of male beauty back then. And he was remarkably tall for his time, around 190 centimetres, 6 feet 3 inches, while the average height of a European man was between 162 and 170 centimetres. We know this because his remains were exhumed in 1789 and measured. But in the end, I say, let's forgive the modernised looks and beauty standards of the show's characters and focus instead on what matters more, the real history behind the drama. The series covers 21 years, from 1464 to 1485. And to be fair, a lot of the major historical threads are portrayed quite well. Elizabeth's meeting with Edward, Warwick's plots, Chichetta's courtly schemes, and her entire portrayal, they all come across vividly and with real attention to the spirit of the time. But the problem is, at some point the show starts drifting away from history and into the realm of gossip and rumour, presenting them as if they were confirmed facts. Take this for example. After Edward regains the throne, the series shows him and his brothers heading to the Tower and personally smothering Henry VI in his bed to eliminate the threat. Elizabeth just happens to walk in and witness the murder. Pure drama. Now, in reality, Henry VI did die one day before Edward's second coronation, on May 21st, 1471. And yes, the timing was very suspicious. Most people at the time believed Edward had him killed, but no serious historical source suggests Edward himself smothered Henry with a pillow. The more accepted version is that Henry was murdered while praying in the Wakefield Tower. For a long time, the blame was placed on Richard, largely thanks to Thomas More, who wrote his biography during the reign of Henry VIII. And let's be honest, it's not like he was going to paint a flattering picture of the man who was the enemy of the king's father. Also, interesting detail, the cause of death may not have been smothering at all. In 1910, Henry's body was exhumed, and his skull was found to be severely fractured. There was also blood on the remaining strands of hair. But since early 20th century forensic science was still in its infancy, we don't have all the answers. What we do know is this: the show dramatised the facts, again. Another example of how this series leans into rumour rather than fact, and something it's often criticised for, is the heavy use of mystical and magical elements. To be honest, I kind of liked it. I don't believe in magic myself, but it definitely added some atmosphere. But let's ask the question. Was Elizabeth Woodville really a witch? Philippa Gregory's idea that the Woodvilles were actual witches does have a tiny grain of historical basis. In 1469, during the time when Warwick had taken control of King Edward and was basically running the kingdom through him, Elizabeth's mother, Chichetta, was accused of witchcraft. A man named Thomas Wake claimed he had an image of lead made like a man-at-arms, about the length of a finger, broken in the middle and held together with a wire, and that Jacquetta had made it for use in witchcraft and sorcery. He even got a parish priest to back him up, saying that Jacquetta had created 2 figures representing the king and queen, supposedly to use as some kind of love spell to ensure Edward would marry her daughter. But here's the thing. The people of London supported Jacquetta, and the case fell apart pretty quickly. There was no real evidence, just accusations. Later, Richard III tried to revive the witchcraft claim, using it as a legal argument that his brother Edward's marriage to Elizabeth had been invalid. But aside from those 2 moments, there's no historical source that seriously treats the Woodville women as actual witches. Still, accusing women of witchcraft was hardly a new tactic. From Joan of Arc to Anne Boleyn, it was often a convenient way to silence a woman who didn't fit the mould, or who had too much power. So, what do you think? Did the magical storyline add a fun twist to the show, or was it just too much fantasy? And now, it's time to redeem the reputation of the most unfairly portrayed woman in the entire series, Margaret Beaufort. First of all, the series gives her a secret romance with Jasper Tudor, the brother of her first husband. And later, it even shows her smothering him with a pillow. But, let's be clear, there's no historical evidence to support any of that. Most likely, their relationship was purely political, built on a shared goal to keep young Henry Tudor alive and eventually put him on the throne. But, hey, what's a historical drama without a forbidden love story, right? By the way, there was a 12-year age gap between them, which the series completely ignores. If Henry Tudor is shown as 5 years old, and we know Margaret gave birth to him at 13, that would make her 18. And Jasper, at that point, was about 30. Yet somehow they're portrayed as the same age on screen. Because TV logic. Then there's the part where the show basically turns Margaret into a villain, accusing her of plotting her own half-brother's death, someone named Richard. But let's do a little basic fact-checking. Margaret's mother, also named Margaret by the way, but with the last name Beauchamp, had 9 children from 3 marriages. So yes, Margaret Beaufort did have half-siblings, but there was no Richard among them. There were 2 Johns and 1 Oliver, each with their own fascinating stories and historical legacies. For example, her elder half-brother, John St. John, was the great-grandfather of Jane Boleyn, a wife of George Boleyn, and her younger half-brother, John Wells, married Cecily of York, who was the sister of Elizabeth of York. But yes, Margaret did technically have a stepbrother named Richard. Her mother, Margaret Beauchamp, was his stepmother. But let's be clear, Richard was much older than Margaret, and it wasn't even him who opposed Edward IV. It was his son. And that son was the one who was executed. But of course, the show doesn't care about details like that. What matters is making Margaret look like a ruthless villain, the kind of woman who would sacrifice her own brother in the name of her son's future throne, or to get back at her mother, depending on the mood. And now we come to the most outrageous accusation the series makes against Margaret Beaufort, her supposed role in the deaths of the princes in the Tower. According to the show, it's Margaret who pressures the Duke of Buckingham to arrange their murder. But here's something I noticed when I rewatched that episode of The White Queen closely. Anna Neville is also portrayed as someone interested in the boys' deaths. So basically, the series just removes Richard III from the equation entirely and splits the blame between these 2 women. In reality, though, most historians place the responsibility squarely on men, and most often on Richard III himself. Although some theories mention Henry VII or Henry Stafford. Of course, the mystery of the princes in the Tower is a huge and ongoing topic. Historians are still debating, and new theories continue to appear. For example, the Missing Princes Project, launched in 2021, suggests that the older prince, Edward V, may have actually survived and lived out his life in rural England. That's also the version we see in the show, where Elizabeth Woodville, not wanting to put all her diamonds in one basket, swaps her second son with another boy and hides the real one in secret. But again, that's all speculation. So the case of the missing princes? Still unsolved. If Margaret Beaufort had anything to do with it, we certainly don't have any hard proof. So the show basically turned her into a religious fanatic, ready to kill anyone in her path, with no real justification. And now, yet another love story invented by the series, but never confirmed by actual history. The supposed romance between Richard III and his niece, Elizabeth of York. The show, clearly enjoying its habit of adding dramatic relationships, leans into this storyline. But let's break it down properly. At the time, there were rumours circulating at court that Richard might marry his niece. But Richard himself publicly denied them on March 30th, 1485, in front of several prominent London officials. It's true that after the death of Anne Neville, he was considering remarriage, just not to Elizabeth, but to Joanna of Portugal, a Portuguese princess. Marrying Elizabeth would have made no real political sense for Richard. Not only was such close kinship frowned upon in England, but he had also declared Elizabeth and her siblings illegitimate. So marrying her would have completely contradicted his own political stance, basically undermining his own claim to the throne. As for historical proof of any actual relationship, all we have is the fact that Richard once gave her a book, signed in his own hand. That's it. So, those awkward tense scenes before battle, the long stares, the unspoken tension, all made up for the sake of drama, not grounded in history. Oh, and speaking of the final battle between Richard III and Henry VII, the one that took the crown from one man and handed it to the other, let's just say, the show clearly didn't have much of a budget for battle scenes, or for decent stunt coordination, or, frankly, for anyone who knew how to stage a believable fight. The most obvious issue? The Battle of Bosworth Field. Don't you know, field being the key word, takes place in a forest. Seriously. A forest? In reality, the battle happened on open ground, and it was a dramatic and crucial turning point in English history. The way it's shown is incredibly underwhelming, especially considering that Richard was actually well prepared, and one of the most critical moments of the real battle was his cavalry charge straight toward Henry's position. He nearly killed him, and if he had, history would have taken a very different turn. But apparently, for this climactic moment, the series only had about 20 extras running back and forth with swords. It's a shame, really, because this was one of the most defining moments in the Wars of the Roses, and it deserved a far more powerful and intense portrayal than what we got. So, to sum it all up, The White Queen is actually a really good series, and far more believable than its follow-ups, The White Princess, and especially The Spanish Princess. If you're looking to fall in love with the world of the Wars of the Roses, this show is definitely worth your time. Just make sure you keep one eye on the screen and the other on, well, at the very least, Wikipedia. A little fact-checking never hurts when history meets drama. But what about you? Did the White Queen steal your heart? If you enjoyed this video, I'd be so grateful for a like. And what series or historical film should we explore together in a future video?